Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's webinar, Understanding and Addressing Violence Against Transgender People in California. We turn to our moderator for today's discussion, Aiden Scheim, who is the Senior Scholar of Public Policy here at the Williams Institute. Aiden?
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. It's my honor to be able to moderate this webinar today with a really incredible panel of speakers. Um, I won't waste much time in introducing them, save as much time as possible to hear both about research that has been conducted to understand violence against trans people in California, and also strategies that are being undertaken at both government and community levels to prevent and respond to violence when it is experienced. We have two presenters from the Williams Institute who will present on research about hate crimes and other forms of violence against transgender people in California. So we'll begin with presentations from Joshua Ariales, the Renberg Law Fellow at the Williams Institute, as well as Dr. Elon Meyer, Distinguished Senior Scholar of Public Policy, also at the Williams Institute. We'll then have responses from Alec Watts, who is Deputy Director of Research and Policy for the California Civil Rights Department, and Pamela Halliwell, Director of Behavioral Health Services at the San Diego LGBT Community Center. I'll also introduce the speakers one at a time before they each speaks, so you remember who they are. I also want to thank the California Department of Civil Rights for providing funding for the Williams Institute research that is being presented today. After we have each of these speakers share with you, I will ask them some questions, and then we will open it up to questions from all of you who have attended today. You can at any point use the Q&A feature in Zoom to enter your questions. Please put them there rather than in the chat so they don't get lost. We'll be using the chat to share links to resources that our speakers mentioned today, so we want to ensure that it stays clear for that, and I'll be looking at the Q&A to make sure that we address your questions there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joshua Ariales, he, him pronouns, from Williams Institute, who will present on hate crime law in California.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. It means a lot that you come out to support our work as well as the work that we do in collaboration with our partners. So as our moderator mentioned, I will be going over kind of an overview of California law regarding hate crimes. So I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint that I put together today, and this will be available for anybody who wishes to look at it after our webinar is over. So I guess we need to start off with talking about what is a hate crime. And a hate crime is actually exactly what it sounds like. It's a criminal offense that's motivated by bias. So I put an example here of a same-sex couple moving into a new neighborhood. Shortly thereafter, their home is vandalized with a homophobic slur. So here we have the criminal offense, which is the vandalism, and it was motivated by bias. They're a same-sex couple, and their home was vandalized with a homophobic slur. Now, in this conversation that we're going to have today, as well as some of the materials that California puts out, you might also hear a term called hate incident or hate bias incident. And that is just like hate crime, very simple. It's an incident that's motivated by bias. Instead of a crime, we have just an incident. So here I have an example of a neighbor walking by and calling the same-sex couple who just moved into the new neighborhood a slur. Calling somebody a slur is not a crime, so that's why we would classify this as a hate incident or a bias incident. And as you might notice, I've also put perceived bias instead of bias motivated. And that's because oftentimes when it comes to a hate incident, because it isn't a crime, we don't generally involve the justice system. So no, so the person who determines whether there is bias motivating the incident is the victim themselves. So we say that there was perceived bias because there isn't an outside individual determining whether the incident was motivated by bias. So with that understanding, a lot of you might be wondering, well, who does hate crime law and hate incidents address? And generally speaking, all of you watching this webinar right now are protected by hate crime law. You are protected whether you are targeted because of disability, gender, nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with persons who have those characteristics. And within the protections for gender, we include protecting sex, gender identity, and gender expression. So it's a very broad set of persons that we protect. And you can also be protected by hate crime law, even if you do not belong to any of the protected characteristics. So, for example, if you moved into a new neighborhood and you were targeted with a homophobic slur on your home, it doesn't matter whether you yourself are gay. What matters is what the perpetrator perceived you as. So you would still be protected under hate crime law. So what are the main hate crime statutes in California? Specifically looking at the California Penal Code, we have three big main statutes, which is 422.6, point 7, and 0.75. There's no need to memorize the numbers. These just pertain to the appropriate section within the California Penal Code. So many of you might be familiar with the structure of 422.7 and 0.75, where usually you'll see, for example, a criminal statute that criminalizes some sort of action, but then will add an additional sentence, whether it be like through additional years or raising the severity of the crime because it was motivated by hate. So, for example, point 7 punishes misdemeanor hate crimes, and 0.75 punishes felony hate crimes. So, if somebody were to assault another individual, and that is, let's say it's a misdemeanor assault, and it was motivated by bias, then we would automatically raise that to be a felony assault. And if it was a felony assault, the sentence for that particular assault can be raised anywhere from around 1 year to 4 years. Now, 422.6 is a kind of unique statute. There are a handful of other states that have a similar statute, like Colorado, but it does tend to be pretty rare. So it does prohibit injury and vandalism, which are crimes in and of themselves. But what really interests us is this prohibition of interference with another individual's rights. And what that means is somebody can't, either by threat of force, by force, or by intimidating you, cannot interfere with your ability to enjoy your rights. So one right that you have is the ability to patronize public accommodations. So restaurants, let's say. So an example, if a transgender individual wanted to go and patronize a restaurant, but somebody came up to them and said, if you go into that restaurant, I'm going to punch you. That would be an interference with that individual's rights, and the perpetrator can be sentenced under 422.6, which is a misdemeanor. One thing that I think a lot of us kind of think of when we think of hate crime laws is the criminal law, right? But there are other ways that we can address hate crimes, and California kind of has these three big buckets of other ways that they address hate crimes and hate incidents, and that is through police education, data recording, and grants. In terms of police education, police have to go through training regarding hate crimes as well as the LGBTQ community. So this can involve anything from cultural competency to learning how to identify hate crimes, including interacting with victims and also learning de-escalation tactics. In addition, all law enforcement agencies within California are required to report their hate crime data to the state. And so that was actually how we were able to get a lot of the data that we used for our project. In addition, colleges and universities within the California state have to report and make their hate crime data publicly available for you all. So you can probably go and look at, if you went to a institution of higher education here, you can probably look at the hate crimes that have happened within the past year. And then California also offers a set of grants, sometimes available to community organizations working with victims of hate crimes, as well as people people and institutions who have like particularly vulnerable buildings, such as, for example, LGBT centers that may be particularly vulnerable to hate crimes in order to kind of boost their security. Now, while we are talking about California hate crime today, it's important to note that we fall under federal jurisdiction as well. And within the federal system, there are a couple of hate crime laws that are relevant to the conversation. Many of you may be familiar with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Act, which basically prohibits committing any sort of harm against another individual. And this includes individuals victimized for gender and gender identity. In addition, the federal government does require that institutions of higher education also report and make their hate crime data publicly available. And they do require that federal law enforcement agencies report their hate crime data. And this is, if you guys are interested, the FBI website actually has this really nice dashboard where you can go and look at the trends over time of hate crimes that have happened within the last several years. And you can filter also by motivation. And lastly, the federal government does offer lots of grants for law enforcement departments, as well as setting up like hotlines to report hate crimes if states are interested in doing so. But oftentimes these grants are mainly designated for like resource intensive hate crime investigations, and states can also request for assistance with handling hate crime investigations. So hopefully I've given you a comprehensive bird's eye view of what we're going to be talking about today. But I encourage all of you to read the report that we put out. If there's anything that kind of struck your fancy, I encourage you to read that section on it. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thanks so much, Joshua. And I'll remind folks that if you have any questions, don't worry about forgetting them. You can put them in the Q&A now, and we'll get to them towards the end of the webinar. Pleasure now to introduce Ilan Meyer, who uses he, him pronouns, distinguished senior scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute, who will present on exposure to hate crimes and violence amongst transgender people in California.
Thank you, Aidan, and thank you, Joshua, for that good introduction to the law that we're going to discuss actually in my presentation as well. Let me share that with you. I want to acknowledge the California Department of Civil Rights for their support of this and several projects we've done on trans violence, and advocates for Trans Equality Education Fund for the use of the 2022 U.S. Transgender Survey data set. I also want to acknowledge, in addition to my co-author, Jody Herman and Nathan Cisneros, who helped a lot with this project, and its success, hopefully. But if it's not successful, it's my fault. Starting with violence against LGBT people in the United States, what we know about that, and that is comes from the National Crime Victimization Survey. That is a national survey, a probability sample, meaning it's a representative sample of all U.S. residents. And what we found there is that LGBT people as a whole and transgender people specifically have much higher rates of experiencing victimization compared with non-LGBT persons, about 5 times more. As you see by these numbers, these are per 1,000 rather than percent, but you see the huge difference in exposure. The National Crime Victimization Survey also showed very significant differences by race ethnicity. This is US wide. What you see here is that among non-LGBT people, there's not a big difference by race ethnicity in terms of violent victimization. And there's different definition of what is measured in this survey. This survey is all self-reported. So they ask people, have you been a victim of a crime? And then they ask them more questions about that. And what you see here that Hispanic, Black and Hispanic populations are much more likely to be exposed to violence among LGBT people, but not so in the general population based on this survey. In this presentation, I would focus on our results from the U.S. Transgender Survey, or USTS. This is a large data set collected in the United States um, with a volunteer or non-probability sample of transgender and non-binary people. We look here and present today the results only for California, but we're lucky to have almost 10,000, 9,146 people in California who filled out this survey. So in that it is self-reported, it is similar to the NCVS in that people report on their own experience of violence. Just looking at the survey demographic characteristic, you see that they tend to be younger, which is something we know from population estimates of transgender non-binary people. At the bottom of this table, you can see that there are more transgender women and assigned female at birth non-binary, with trans men at the third most likely, and assigned male at birth non-binary with only 8%, or with 8%, I shouldn't say only. So going right into our findings, we found we estimated several instances or several types of violence, threat, and harassment. So I'm going to start from the right side of this slide. You see that 7% reported physical attack, 17% reported bathroom violence or harassment, 19% reported threats of violence, 38% reported verbal, and 42% online harassment. In total, 60% almost of transgender and non-binary people experience some form of a violence, threat, or harassment. So that's overwhelming majority of the people reported that. Looking specifically at physical attacks, we found that half of them had more than one attack reported. So this is not a rare occasion, not only in terms of how prevalent it is, but also of how many times it occurs. We measured trans visibility because we thought that's an important variable in terms of how people perceive you in public. And what we found is that 46% of the respondents reported that they believe that they are rarely or never perceived as transgender. 16% reported that they are visible always or most of the time. And the reason why this is important, you can see in this slide, we see that people on the right side of the slide who said that they're almost always or most of the time visible had higher rates of victimization and violence exposure compared to people who rarely or sometimes exposed. This is a little bit different for trans women. As you see in the sometimes and always is just as likely, 10% of them were experienced victimization or violence. This is by race ethnicity. We don't see as many differences as we saw in the national data from the NCVS for LGBT people that I just showed you. But what we do see here is for trans women who are Hispanic or other race, they are much more likely to experience violence. This is asking about the relationship with the person committing the violence against the person, the trans or non-binary person. And we see that in most of the cases it's a stranger, but there's also a significant number of people who are experience violence by a relative or partner or people they have relationships with, um, which is something that also we know that happens in transgender people as well as some LGBT people, where you can be exposed to violence even within your family and definitely within your community. These are the types of violence attacks that were measured by their frequency. And you see that the most frequent was grabbing, punching, and choking, with almost 10% or 9% with a knife or other weapon, and 4%, additional 4% with a gun. So again, very significant exposure to violence. This is an odds ratio, which is a way to measure the likelihood that something is impacting a result that we see. And I'm just going to go through the first line here. What we see here is that compared to people who said they're rarely or never visible, people who said they're always or all of the time visible were about 2.5 times more likely to experience any violence or harassment, 4 times more likely to experience bathroom violence, and almost 2 times more likely to experience physical violence. This is what those numbers indicate or how you can interpret them. And again, this is compared to people who said they were rarely or never visible based on their self-perception, but this is still among a group that is highly likely to experience violence. So it just shows who among them is even more likely to experience violence. Um, I now want to turn to a different data set, and this is data reported to California Department of Justice by law enforcement and prosecutors on hate crime incidents motivated by gender identity. In this case, we call it incidents until it is determined to be a crime, but these are all reports by basically police, sheriff departments in California. And what we see here is looking at the different categories of victimization, of motivation. We see that sexual orientation and gender identity are affected about a quarter of the population, which is much higher than the estimate proportion of LGBT people in California. In 2013, the California Department of Justice added anti-gender nonconforming as a bias category distinct from anti-transgender. So we looked at those two categories for reports from 2013, and what we found is 522 gender identity hate crime events involving anti-transgender and anti-gender nonconforming bias. Again, this is reported by law enforcement. In this slide, you see the annual prevalence, and you see clearly a rise in anti-gender nonconforming and anti-transgender violence. And you see here the contribution of the gender nonconforming motivation in yellow, which is a small proportion of the total, but still an important category to consider. In terms of the type of hate crimes that people experience, we see that those that were motivated by gender identity were more likely by a lot to be violent crimes. And this compared with other types of motivations, this is the highest proportion of violent crime perpetrated. So this is against transgender and gender non-binary. In terms of the motivating, the type of violence, you see here a simple assault, aggravated assault. The difference between simple and aggravated is that aggravated involves some kind of weapon or threat of physical harm. And you see those are 70%, again, a very strong, big percent of the people who experienced it. Finally, I want to state one thing about reported experiences of hate crimes. This is showing differences in reports by different regions in California, but it is important to note that reporting of hate crimes is not something that is uniformly done. Some counties you see did not report any, and there is some uh, um, doubt that we have to apply to those numbers in terms of is it the entire population of people. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Aidan and look forward for our discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. And I'll remind people once more that if you have questions for any of our speakers so far, please use the Q&A function and I'll get to them later in our webinar. I'm now going to turn to Alec Watts, who uses any pronouns from the California Civil Rights Department, who will speak about the Civil Rights Department's anti-hate initiatives.
All right, thank you, Aidan. So as Joshua mentioned, California law has a very inclusive definition of gender across its hate crime laws, but California civil rights laws also are inclusive when it comes to covering gender identity and expression, and they also include protections from hate violence. So today what I'll do is highlight some of the programs and resources we have available at the Civil Rights Department to protect the civil rights of people in California, which includes, of course, the transgender community. Just a quick overview. Among other initiatives, the Civil Rights Department conducts extensive outreach and education activities to ensure Californians have information about their rights and responsibilities. Members of the public can also file a civil rights complaint with us directly if they believe their civil rights are violated. CRD also provides free conflict resolution services to communities. We operate the California versus Hate resource line and network, which provides services to those targeted for hate. And we house the Commission on the State of Hate. I'll touch on each of these programs briefly, and we'll share links in the chat where you can learn more and access these resources. With respect to outreach and education, so as I mentioned, we do reach out to communities across California in order to really empower them with the knowledge they need about their civil rights. We attend community events, we conduct trainings and webinars, but we also develop resources to help you understand your rights. I included the names of some of these resources right here. This is just a sample of what we have. We have a wealth of fact sheets, posters, and guides on various topics, including civil rights protections related to employment, housing, human trafficking, and hate violence. I encourage you to visit our website to check out some of these resources and download them, and we will send a link to that website in the chat, I believe. I think that's sent. Okay. As I mentioned, another resource we have is that members of the public can also file a complaint with CRD directly if they believe their civil rights were violated. Each year, the department investigates thousands of these complaints, and in some cases, CRD brings people together to actually resolve the complaint through mediation, and where appropriate, CRD also files lawsuits in court. We'll send a link on our process for filing a complaint in the chat as well. CRD also houses a unit we call the Community Conflict Resolution Unit. We call this CREW. So CREW offers a range of conflict resolution services to help communities when they experience fear, conflict, or tension, specifically arising from acts of discrimination, hate crimes, and even non-criminal acts of hate. The services that CREW provides are free, voluntary, and confidential. And I listed some examples of some of the things that they can do to help. They can convene different groups to facilitate discussion after an incident happens that caused fear in a community. They can even develop educational materials to help groups learn more about their rights and respond to community issues. And they can also assist schools where tension exists between students, between adults, or both. And those are just some examples of some things they can do. And again, these services are free. Anybody in California can request them, and we will send a link in the chat on how to request CREW's services. We also operate the California versus Hate resource line. So this is a non-emergency reporting hotline for anybody in California who either experiences hate or witnesses hate. They can call in and make a report. Or they can make the reports online. But I do want to emphasize that California versus Hate is more than just a reporting hotline. When you report, what happens is a trauma-informed care coordinator will pick up the phone and offer to connect you to the resources that you need, including legal services, financial aid, mental health services, and mediation services. California versus Hate can take reports in over 200 languages, and the services are free and regardless of a person's immigration status. The number to call California versus Hate is 8338 no hate, or you can file a report online at cavshate.org. And we'll put that in the chat as well. Finally, CRD houses the Commission on the State of Hate, which is an advisory body established to strengthen California's efforts in three main areas: monitoring hate and understanding what's happening with hate in California. That's the first one. Preventing hate and making sure that we can reduce hate across the state. And the third area is responding to hate activity. So how can we better respond when hate happens? And we do this, we make recommendations based on community-informed research, education, and advisement. The key deliverable of the Commission on the State of Hate is this annual report. We expect the next report to be out this month, actually, so keep an eye out for that. And the report contains our findings on each of the three areas I mentioned. Each year, the report discusses significant patterns and trends in hate in California from the past year and reviews evidence for various approaches to both preventing and reducing hate and also supporting victims and communities after hate occurs. So I just included a few excerpts related to our work on LGBTQ plus hate, just to give you an idea of what this looks like. The report also contains evidence-based recommendations on how to improve California's responses to hate. Beyond the report, we also produce other resources. We help to develop a training for police officers in California, which is pictured on the left side. This is for the implementation of AB 449. You can even view the training on YouTube. We also host public events throughout the state to highlight specific topics, such as the mental health impacts of hate, a forum where Professor Meyer actually presented a little while ago. And we also had a forum recently on hate against people with disabilities, which is pictured here. And we also attend community events. And here's the chair of the commission actually at promoting California versus Hate at Palm Springs Pride, I think it was. So we'll include a link to the Commission on the State of Hate in the chat. Just to wrap up, we have a wealth of resources available to you if you experience hate or even if you witness hate. And each of these resources approaches hate in somewhat different ways to really meet the needs of people affected by hate. And we encourage you to take advantage of these resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alec, and thank you to those who have continued to put questions into the Q&A, which we'll get to shortly. Continuing on the theme of addressing violence against trans people in California, I'm going to turn now to Pamela Hallowell, who uses she, her pronouns, and is the Director of Behavioral Health Services at the San Diego LGBT Community Center.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to join this conversation. I serve as the Director of Behavioral Health Services at the San Diego LGBT Community Center, where we provide individual therapy, substance use services, support groups, youth programming, and community-based prevention work for LGBTQ plus folks across the San Diego region. As of this year, the center has served the San Diego LGBTQ plus community for 54 years. The center is one of the largest and most vibrant LGBTQ plus community centers in the country, and the second oldest LGBTQ plus community center in the country. Every day, our teams are working with trans and non-binary folks, navigating not just isolated incidents of violence, but also the chronic exposure to discrimination, harassment, housing instability, and economic vulnerability. As someone who works at that intersection of behavioral health, community practice, and research, what stands out to me as a professional from these reports is this gap between legal protection and lived safety. So we live in California, right? And so California has some of the strongest legal frameworks protecting trans and non-binary folks. And yet somehow 59% of trans adults in this state report reported experiencing violence or harassment in the past year. The most consistent predictor across these categories, online harassment, bathroom violence, to physical attacks, is about trans visibility. Individuals who believe that they are perceived as trans most or all the time experience significantly higher rates of violence, even after controlling for race, economics, education, and age demographically. So I feel like that tells us something that's really important. Violence is not some random act that's occurring. It is patterned. It is structural. It interacts with social perceptions and economic vulnerability. And in my own research examining documented fatal violence against Black trans women, we saw some similar patterns. Violence which occurred in context of economic precarity, relational vulnerability, and social isolation. Fatal violence is often the extreme endpoint of the same structural conditions that are reflected in the survey data. And further information from our research article characterizing the prevalence and perpetrators of documented fatal violence indicated that a lot of the harm that was done for those folks across the US was interrelational with partners that needed more education, that dealt with a real threat of masculinity, and therefore violence was a way to reassert that masculinity. As a therapist directing behavioral services, I see what this exposure looks like after, this statistic. It looks like chronic hypervigilance. It looks like young people navigating online harassment that follows them home. It looks like people being removed from their homes. It looks like fear. It looks like shame. It looks like discrimination that feels overwhelming and contributes to a host of other mental health symptoms that become overwhelming and damaging. It looks like housing instability amplifying vulnerability. It looks like communities carrying cumulative stress. I'm also involved in the Radiant study examining transgender people in relationships, which further reinforces how stigma and economic pressure intersect with safety outcomes. And beyond research and clinical work, I write fiction in a series that's centered on grief, resilience, and rebirth. Because even in the face of violence data, our communities are not defined solely by harm. We're defined by survival, by connection, by rebuilding. So the question for us is not simply how we prosecute violence, it's how do we prevent vulnerability. To trans folks that might be watching, I just want to take a moment to say that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. The data here reflects real harm, but it also reflects a community that continues to show up, build networks, create chosen families, and demand better systems. Safety should not require invisibility, and prevention should not depend on individual resilience. The goal is not simply survival, it is thriving. As someone who works directly with trans folks every day and part of a trans affirming program, I want to say clearly your reactions to discrimination and harassment are not overreactions. They're human responses to real stressors. And while the data highlights risk, which is undeniable, especially for our BIPOC communities, Black and Brown, trans women especially, it also highlights where intervention is possible. Structural vulnerability can be addressed. Prevention is possible, and community care is real and expanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I really appreciate also ending with some hopeful words and thinking about the strengths of trans communities as well as the challenges we face. And your research you led is also now linked in the chat, so thanks for highlighting that as well. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative now and ask a few questions of our panelists, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if all the panelists want to, yeah, come back on camera. I will pick on you for a few moments. And I will start with the question for Ilan. I wanted to ask you, you you use both administrative data collected through reports to police as well as self-reported survey data. And I'm wondering if you could briefly comment on how the strengths and limitations of both of those types of data and how they might complement each other.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important point. And we do have two sources of data in the United States as a whole. Uh, One is reported by police and sheriff departments to the Department of Justice, both the same way that we have in California. It's true nationally. And the second is self-report. So here we use the USTS data. I previously showed you the NCVS data, which is a national data set, which is also self-reported. The difference is that, as is not going to surprise anybody, many people who are experience violence do not report it to the police to start with. And even those who report it, the police has to determine that it is a hate crime or at least a suspected hate crime for us to hear about it in those hate crime reports. And then they have to send it upstream to, in California, the states, and nationally to the Department of Justice nationally. And in each of those steps, there is a huge bias against complete record, right? So not everybody reports, not everybody who reports is assessed to actually be a hate crime, and not everybody who is assessed to be an actual hate crime is actually reported upward so that it gets into the data. There are also so in some ways I rely on the individual reports more because I feel we get a more complete picture. In the hate crime data, there's also some differences in what are considered crimes that are reportable. And in the self-report, you have obviously more variability. I showed you some of the categories that we discerned from the USTS. So they're not perfect match. The serious crimes, the violent crimes are obviously asked about and also reported, but there's some differences in the reported uh, crimes. But we know from data that as many as 50% of people don't report anything to the police. That is, by the way, true across not just LGBT, but even straight cisgender people in the United States, and definitely communities of color. And so and we can talk about why that is. But so the hate crime statistics we get from the FBI, there's a FBI report, and from California are going to be limited. And that's why I showed you the data on this California regions, sorry, counties that reported. You saw that there is not a complete set of data there. So there's various ways that this data is a serious underestimate. On self-report, you can also say, as Joshua indicated before, the person perceived it to be based on bias. And that is a complicated question for people to assess. I'm actually doing a whole study right now about that. And we know that people tend to actually underestimate bias reports. There is research that shows, for example, that Black women in the workplace are benefiting from not even noticing racist comments and such because it basically to maintain your mental health you can't be focused on that. So under reporting it, even under noticing it, is functional, psychologically functional, but again may lead to underreporting even in self-report. And just one last thing I would say about it, I once did a study where we asked people narratives, but we also asked them to report a scale, a measure that is very often used on anti-discrimination experiences. And there was a discrepancy between what they told us in the same interview when we asked them to narrate things to what happened to them and what they wrote in the response to the survey, where they didn't report some things that they told us in the survey, which is again confirming the idea that It is number one, not easy to identify bias, motivated discrimination or violence. And number two, people often tend to underreport it. So these are all limitations in both data sets. Thanks.
Thank you, Ilan. Keeping the focus on data for a moment, Alec, I have a question for you. My question was going to be, I know your office also conducts research on hate. Can you tell us what that research reveals about patterns in hate against trans people in California? And I'll also pair that with a question that came in through the Q&A, which was about whether someone can access statistics at the county level about hate against trans people.
Thank you for the question, Aiden, and thank you from the person who attended who gave us that question. I'll answer that question first. Yes, so the California Department of Justice publishes an annual hate crime statistics report that is available on their website, and they do break down hate crimes by county. I believe they also break it down by bias. I'm not 100% sure, but Elon, I think
Yeah,
is
that is
nodding.
what
Yeah.
we used actually. So all
Yeah.
of the
So
data showed. Yeah.
you can do that. You can look at it by county, and you can also look at it over time. So that should be accessible on their website. Just to answer your first question, one thing the Commission on the State of Hate does each year is we review all these different data sets that exist on hate in California, whether it's from the Department of Justice, California versus Hate. In some cases, we procure data sets. So we partner with the California Health Interview Survey, which conducts a survey of 20,000 households every year in California. And we also synthesize the results from our analyses of these data with qualitative accounts of hate that we hear from the state, either from media reports or things that come into us from community forums or public comment. So I'll share just a few data points from what we've learned. For some people, this may not be particularly surprising. We found when we looked at the California Health Interview Survey data, again, these are self-reports that Elon was talking about. We found significantly higher rates of hate that transgender and gender expansive people are facing relative to people who are cisgender. I'm looking at the numbers. It looks like over 1 in 4, so that's 26% of transgender and gender expansive people experienced an act of hate within just 1 year in our survey, which is 3 times the rate for cisgender people. And if we look at lesbian, gay, bisexual, or pansexual people, it's about a rate of 2 times as 2x compared to straight people. We also looked at the Department of Justice data, and we saw, similar to what Elon mentioned, which is just gender identity hate crimes increasing over time. And of course, then there's a qualitative aspect of this. So a lot of us, we look at the data and it sort of resonates with things that either we've seen, we've experienced, we've heard. And unfortunately, it's not hard to find acts of anti-LGBTQ plus hate in California. And so every year we go through news reports and there's pellet gun shootings in San Diego, things happening in Sacramento, bomb threats against trans advocacy organizations. This stuff is all over. And the data reflects that. And I'll just end with just a plug for all the resources that we have available to deal with the different forms that hate takes and to address, I think, the elevated levels of hate that we're seeing right now.
Thanks, Alec. And then Pamela, I have a follow-up question for you as well. I really appreciated your, framing violence against trans people as a structural issue. And so I wanted to give you a chance to reflect more on policy changes that would be helpful to better prevent and respond to violence against trans people in California. Um, and then also actually bringing in a question from the chat, thinking about the structural level, but also at the individual level. There was a question in the chat from someone whose daughter is trans and is concerned about her safety and was asking about taking a self-defense class with her. And so more broadly, perhaps wanted to ask you about strategies that trans people are using personally to protect themselves, to protect ourselves from violence.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question from our participant. And I might have to circle back to the very first question that you asked there, Aiden. So I think it makes a lot of sense for trans non-binary folks to be aware and be cautious and to be taking whatever steps that folks need to take to feel more safe and kind of in control, of what you have the ability to control. So I've certainly heard a number of folks that we've worked with and wanting to learn, about different options for safety, being in teams, having certain group chats and other mechanisms. We can't function ongoing, our mental health, our psyche cannot function ongoing in a survival mode for forever, right? Because that's where we see a lot of our mental health stuff really like creeping up. And so we have to have a sense of like balance in terms of like finding things that still give us joy, finding community, being as strategic with that as possible. But it's absolutely the right time to just be mindful of where you're going, trying to not travel in spaces where it's dark, where you don't kind of, know the area super duper well. And there's a number, I think, of discussion groups, support groups, pathways to connect with other people who can share, different tactics and ideas. And I also, again, despite the data, there's a lot of power that I think that we're still seeing in community, right? Because we're in one of the strongest states with so many, protections against trans and non-binary folks. And I think that that certainly means a lot. In addition, however, just because we have resources doesn't mean that those resources are accessible, right? And so I've heard in our time together today about different reporting pathways. With the folks that I'm working with in community, they're not aware and they're not feeling necessarily super safe about calling some of these more non-law enforcement reporting hotlines. I think that there's work that we need to do there. So that those folks know that these resources are accessible because there's so much more fear politically that's worked its way to the very communities that we're living in and serving in. And also, I think it's really important to have like immediate safe housing for survivors, culturally specific trans victim services. But I'm so sorry, Aiden. What was your initial question before I just ramble?
No, it's okay. You've gotten to so many other parts of it. But just about any like policy changes you'd want to see to both prevent violence, but also to respond to it.
Yeah, so some policies that I'm thinking of.
I think Pamela's video froze. While I give a moment for Pamela maybe to reboot the Wi-Fi, just recognizing time. Maybe what I'll do is pop in another question that came in from the chat and then come back because I want to hear the rest of Pamela's answer. So I will turn quickly to the next question that had come through my screen, which was research showing, someone said, research shows a recent uptick in hate crimes against trans people. Why might this be?
Are you asking in general?
Yeah, that can be for anyone. It wasn't directed at a specific panelist.
Well, I mean, we don't have specific data, but I think anybody who opens the newspaper every day in the United States these days can see really horrific attacks on transgender populations. And in my mind, that would have a strong effect on people who want to who take that as a clue and take that as a command even sometimes. I mean, the attacks on transgender people, to be honest, remind me of Nazi Germany in the early days, where Jews were scapegoated. It feels the same way to me here that every problem in the United States is because of transgender people, and of course that has consequences. But that being said, this is my personal view. I don't have actual data directly to support it, but the data is definitely coincident with that. I don't know if anybody has any other ideas. I think,
Yeah, I think I have a similar perspective as you, Elon, in terms of we don't really have the data on this. I do want to just point out that law enforcement data is not just a function of what's happening, but it's also a function of what police are doing, right? So as Elon mentioned, there's lots of counties with zero hate crimes. Probably there are not zero hate crimes happening, right? And so if we see an increase, it means maybe they're taking these things more seriously, they're investigating them, and they're actually collecting the data and reporting it to the Department of Justice as required by law, right? So it's, you know, if when you see an uptick, part of it could be police being trained in in investigating hate crimes. So I just want to throw that out there as another sort of explanation. But
yes.
yeah.
Thanks so much. And I think we have Pamela back. So I want to turn back to you so you can finish what you were saying.
Thank you. My apologies. So, and being kind of wise of our time, I'll kind of break it into prevention, response, and then some accountability. So, in short, in terms of policy changes, housing stability, as violence prevention, economic security initiatives, and funding trans-led community organizations. So that they can do the work that we're attempting to do for support for protective factors and the piece of resilience, because as we can see, it's not just about having legal protections. There's a bigger piece of this here that needs to shift. We're in the state again that has so many protections, and yet we still have so much data that is sharing bathroom violence, harassment, and etc. In terms of response, survivor-centered reporting systems, and as we talked about them today, making sure that those are accessible, making sure that the folks that need to know about them do know about that. And for accountability, evaluate whether hate crime enhancements are actually deterring violence. How do we ensure that data is really reflecting folks across all gender identities? And how do we, ensure that, what we're doing is actually working? So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think I probably have time for sneak in one more quick question. So I'm going to select one of the recent ones that I think can also be answered in the time we have, hopefully. Can anyone on the panel speak to the availability of data related to violence towards Two-Spirit or LGBT people in California Native communities, or other organizations that might collect this data, or any resources, I think, more generally around violence against Two-Spirit, or Indigenous trans people?
Actually, I was just trying to get the information behind this and I saw the question. I am going to assume that USTS asked questions about a two-spirit identity and it probably is available there. I don't remember for a fact, but I'm pretty sure they would have asked that. If that's there, we could potentially, or one could potentially look at the data for two-spirit across all the variables that we just showed, but I wasn't able to verify it yet that we have it, but I think it might be there.
I'm noting we're at time. Jody Herman in the chat just noted that
Yeah,
USCIS does ask about two-spirit identity, so that is analysis that could
yeah.
be
So
done
that's
after.
possible to get. Yeah, I assume that.
Um, I wish we had more time because there are more good questions and comments coming in the chat, but I really appreciate everyone's engagement in discussing this difficult issue, the perspectives that you've all shared, the research you've shared, the expertise you've shared, and thank you everyone for attending. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and take care. Bye, everyone.